grab the
I,
book. Let me grab the book. Look.
yeah. I've pre-unplugged and replugged my speaker or my microphone and camera, so hopefully we have no issues there. But it is past daylight saving time. It is dark outside, and at some point I know my light will turn off, so we'll deal. Okay, so
Life, liberty, or what?
this is I'm really excited about this chapter and what we're getting into. So not that I'm a huge history buff, but I did when I was working for another company. I was traveling a ton. I made it a goal to listen. I was huge into audiobooks at the time, just to keep busy while you're driving across the country, and I got into listening to biographies of the presidents of the United States.
Oh, yeah.
And it was one of those unique goals to get through there. I didn't finish the goal. I need to get back in and keep going, but I got through John Quincy Adams, so 5 in, and then I read a Benjamin Franklin one, so 6, and then you've got Hamilton. So a lot of the contemporaries then, and so definitely had some perspective coming into this chapter, but this for me is what we've kind of been talking about, right? We mentioned in some of the other chapters that originally it was written life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But at one point, and it talks about it in this chapter here, that life, liberty, and property. And because the change in what was feudal England and not owning land to now this owning of land and property, they had a much different sense of what it is, and we're still a little bit in conflict with the Native Americans and how they did or didn't own land and who had rights to it, and we gained some really interesting perspective on George Washington, and his interaction with there. Of course, we always tout him as a surveyor and proudly embrace his name as that. But we talk about quite a few surveyors of the time. Jefferson being a surveyor, Putnam, Daniel Boone. And in this chapter it calls Daniel Boone a brave scout but an incompetent surveyor, which is, I like it. It still doesn't change. We still have some really great people that are really terrible surveyors. So it's it is what it is. So before we jump into it, I just thought we'd take a second here, see if there was any comments or thoughts from this chapter from the group, and kind of get your guys' insights. Okay. I didn't expect anything less. So let's jump in here. So it starts out here with stuff that we all know about. So that first paragraph, the decision of the British Parliament to close the port of Boston in 1774 as punishment for the destruction of valuable cargo of tea brought to the surface the resentment of the northern merchants already burdened by duties on their goods, a general fury at the earlier killing of civilian rioters by British troops, and a pervasive fear that colonial assemblies were powerless against the king's ministries. So just a quick history lesson there. We obviously know about the Boston Tea Party. That's a common knowledge thing they talk about in elementary school and in U.S. history. So in the dark of night, we had a bunch of people that stormed a British ship and threw tea overboard, and so in retaliation of that, the British Parliament closed the port, which then interrupted their commerce.
All over 3%.
Yeah, over 3%, right? We could get into that. We're talking about 30% through most of the counties in Utah right now because of inflation. So 3% sounds pretty dang good.
Yeah, right.
But before that, there was some rioting that had happened there, and there were some riders that were killed as the British troops, you know, purportedly fired without being attacked, right, or provoked. They were just there, and someone pulled the trigger, and then all of a sudden everyone did, and you had some few deaths. And John Adams actually represented the British soldiers there, which brought him notoriety and fame, but also hurt his reputation because as a colonialist and as an American, how dare you represent the British troops, which is just kind of some interesting sides there.
One of the things I just pulled up, the value of the tea destroyed that day would be equivalent to $1 million today. There's 342 chests worth of tea, which equates to $1 million today.
Million bucks. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. Oh,
What
and
would that
we're up
be,
on it. December 16th. Oh, sorry,
What
Jerry.
would that be in 6 packs of beer? We don't drink tea in Wisconsin.
True story. December 16th is when it happened. So
Oh, okay.
yeah.
I don't think I knew or recognized the date there.
Yeah. Jen threw in there some rioting, the Boston
The
Massacre.
Boston Massacre. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's all a matter of perspective, Jen.
That's right.
And so things are getting heated in the Americas here, and the representation across the pond, as it were. And so the colonialists in Philadelphia, we start getting this first Continental Congress, and they're using this to, it says here, articulate their grievances, address the king. But in doing so, they start creating their own laws and regulations. So we get quite a bit of new regulations come in, and we start seeing the America we know start to be formed. Jen through. Jerry says no. Did they have a No King's Day? And then Jen, do you guys not call it that in the rest of the country? I've always called it the Boston Tea Party,
Exactly.
but I recognize the Boston Massacre. Yeah.
Yeah. Funny what we were taught in different parts of the country, right?
Well, there were actually two
Oh.
different events.
Oh,
The
yes,
Boston Tea Party was dumping the tea in the water. The massacre was when they taunted the redcoats, and the redcoats started firing on the crowd. So they are two different things.
Got it.
Sorry. I knew that. It's just I'm thinking on the fly here that, yes, that is correct.
As a
But I don't know that I
Tea
ever knew the name for the Boston Massacre there. I just knew of it from reading or watching John Adams, in his biography there.
It's either that or every time Boston played in the World Series. So
They got a couple since then.
So yeah, let's jump back into it.
Yeah, I know. We can get sidebarred.
I don't know where to go with that one, Jerry. So it says, okay, the first iteration of this, the Declaration of Independence, or our the resolution or airing of grievances, it said that they're entitled to life, liberty, and property. It says in this instance, property meant possessions in general, but this is where we see a lot of the differences between each of the colonies. But for Virginians especially, it was land that they had in mind, in particular land beyond the Appalachians. What had happened is the Crown also forced them to not, declare that they couldn't go any further west, exploring and claiming land. So the first paragraph of the Virginia Constitution, drawn up June 1776 by George Mason, that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. So they wanted to go out and spread out and explore more and claim more land. And the idea for the Crown was to stop the fighting and the wars between their colonists and the the Native Americans. And you have to keep in mind that the American Revolution came right on the heels of an Indian War in which Washington became very popular. Colonel George Washington became very popular, leading the British armies against the Native Americans, the French and Indian War. It says here, I can never look upon the proclamation in any other light, this being the proclamation not to explore out further west. But I say this between ourselves, then as a temporary expedient to quiet the minds of the Indians. Washington wrote in 1767 to his colleague and fellow surveyor, Colonel William Crawford, it must fall, of course, in a few years, especially when those Indians consent to our occupying those lands. Any person who neglects hunting out good lands and in some measure marking and distinguishing them for his own in order to keep others from settling them will never regain it. So that sounds like the precursor to adverse possession or acquiescence in our modern language there. It says Washington was not a man to be deflected by his sovereign's express command, although as a serving officer he deemed it best to be discreet. If you will be at the trouble of seeking out the lands, he continued to Crawford, I will take it upon me the part of securing them as soon as there is a possibility of doing it, and will, moreover, be at the cost and charges of surveying and patenting the same. By this time it will be easy for you to discover that my plan is to secure a good deal of land. You will consequently come in for a handsome quantity. So even Washington's looking at coming through and gathering more. I like that, the word patenting, we see that, we use that word as the original deeds, and so we even see that in Washington's writing here and connecting history through all of that. The book goes into some graphic detail of what happened to Crawford and his companion, and it, quite interesting, but brutal, as they were laid on piles of hot out and beaten, and Crawford was able to get away to tell the tale, but quite terrible things that were happening back then, and really on both sides, to be fair. It says down in the middle of page 50, the atrocities were evidenced by the mounting conflict between the hungry colonists and Native Americans. Consequently, when George III banned land purchases beyond the mountains, it was the proclamation worded it so that the several nations or tribes of the Indians with whom we are connected and who live under our protection should not be molested or disturbed. But even Americans who might have sympathized with this strategy could not accept the king's feudal right to impose the ban. And so once this ban happened, all these different land companies were created to try and expand out west. And so it lists off the Ohio Company, who proposed to purchase 500,000 acres beyond the Ohio River. The Loyal Land Company looked at buying 800,000 acres of Kentucky, but had private ambitions of exploring and acquiring millions more as far as the Pacific Ocean. You had the Mississippi Company, was to settle along the river, and Washington was one of its founders, followed by the Illinois and Wabash Company, with Patrick Henry had an interest in the Watauga Association, which settled eastern Tennessee and later tried to establish the independent state of Franklin. So there's just another interesting thing. I never knew that there could have been a state of Franklin in the United States.
Yeah.
Of course, here's our first judgment against the land surveyors. It says in 1775, Judge Richard Henderson of North Carolina sent Daniel Boone, a brave scout but an incompetent surveyor, to find territory in southern Kentucky. where he signed a treaty with the Cherokee Indians, giving Henderson's Transylvania Company several million acres. It says Boone's surveying lapses made it unclear exactly how much land was involved. The most ambitious of them all, the Vandalia Company, which aimed to acquire 63 million acres in what is now Illinois and Indiana, employed Benjamin Franklin as its London agent, and even counted among its members influential figures in British government: the future Prime Minister, Lord North, the Lord Chancellor, Lord Camden, and it says, "One half of England is now mad," remarked one of its promoters, and everybody there has its eyes fixed on this country. The American dream is growing all the way over to England, because they see this idea of owning land and the American dream that we're starting to see. We hear another name that we hear quite a bit in the revolutionary areas, Rufus Putnam. He found some loopholes. So these powerful interests created some loopholes in the prohibition, but it was still in place in 1773 when a young surveyor named Rufus Putnam sailed up the Mississippi River to Natchez. There he began surveying more than 1 million acres on the banks of the river so that it could be sold to New England veterans of the French and Indian War. So what these colonies did, what the English did, in order to bolster their army's numbers, they started offering land as payment for the veterans of serving. And we'll see here later on that some of those were quite significant amounts of land. Jumping over to the next page here, it says Putnam's prospects were transformed by the French and Indian War. In 1757, he joined the Royal American Regiment, where he became an engineer, a trade that taught him how to carry every kind of measurement. So Putnam is a big figure in the really the first American or colonial surveyors. Putnam had spent 8 months laying out the ground for.
If we're open tomorrow, I'll see you.
Putnam had spent 8 months laying out the ground for future settlements at Natchez when in 1774 the Board of Trade in London declared he was in breach of the Royal Proclamation and issued an order specifically forbidding any further surveys on the Mississippi. Returning home to Massachusetts in a flurry, Putnam found his personal frustration echoed in the accumulating anger of the colonists, and he was one of the first men to be commissioned in the Massachusetts Regiment following the ringing shots at Lexington in April 1775. Putnam's talked about quite a bit in here because of his relationship with Washington. They become very close confidants. He becomes the chief engineer to the army, and to the end of his days, he was Washington's man. It says he was Washington's man, body and soul. In peacetime, all political questions were solved by doing whatever Washington required, and if that was not clear, Putnam would write to ask. Anyone who opposed his general and later his president was an enemy. And one particularly prominent opponent, whose name Putnam could not bring himself to mention in his memoirs, was an arch enemy. It describes Putnam as this kind of able just to do things and solve problems and very smart. And I think that is a trait that we see in many surveyors. We are problem solvers. We're mediators. We just kind of have to get it done sometimes. So I really like that description of this particular surveyor. And now the rest of this chapter here is what I'm most excited about. We start getting into Thomas Jefferson and his role in growing the United States and growing America. And it talks about here, he's got this paradox that always surrounds him. So if you have ever read or learned about him, he was anti-slavery but owned slaves. He was all about the ownership of land, but he changed that declaration to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So it says here, it says, indeed, if there was any one person immune to the general lust for land beyond the Appalachians, it was Jefferson, the Virginian planter. That says, yeah, and then he changed the Declaration of Independence to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is one of the greatest paradoxes in Jefferson's paradoxical character that he, who was to acquire more Western land on behalf of the United States than any speculator could have dreamed of possessing, who laid the foundation of the nation's further territorial expansion to the Pacific by sending Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to find a route to the coast in 1803, who believed passionately in the virtues of owning land and adored his own plantations and garden at Monticello, was so tepid in acquiring it for himself. He acquired most of what he had from his father. And it says he even joined several schemes for acquiring land and then neglected them all and eventually failed at gathering those lands. Talks about his upbringing. He belonged to Virginia. By birth and upbringing, Jefferson belonged to the Virginia plantation aristocracy. His family had been there since the late 17th century. Generations of Jeffersons had followed the frontier west, and to them, land acquisition was second nature. Peter Jefferson, who had not only run the Fairfax line with Thomas Lewis, swamps and ravines of the Blue Ridge, but later extended William Byrd's boundary between Virginia and Carolina almost into Kentucky, and only returned home to build a plantation mansion on the frontier, lay plans with his neighbors to acquire still more land through the Loyal Land Company. So even Jefferson, we talk about him as a great and famous surveyor in the United States, but his dad too was in that profession and gained his many of his riches through doing that. It talks about what changed the course of the boy's life, being Jefferson. So his dad passed away, and all the children were sent to live with guardians, and most of those guardians were members of the Loyal Company, this land company, and so Jefferson's guardians actually sent him to college, to William and Mary College in Williamsburg, and it spends some time talking about a teacher that really influenced him. So there he fell under the influence of a remarkable teacher named William Small. In his autobiography written in his 17s, Jefferson confessed, "It was my great good fortune and what probably fixed the destinies of my life that Dr. William Small of Scotland was then professor of mathematics, a man profound in most of the useful branches of science and with a happy talent of communication, correct and gentlemanly manners, and an enlarged and liberal mind. Jefferson was famously guarded in his emotions, but where Small was concerned, he became almost fulsome. Dr. Small was, to me as a father," Jefferson confided to a friend. "To his enlightened and affectionate guidance of my studies while at college, I am indebted for everything." The brief reference in his autobiography to his real father, the great surveyor, is stark by comparison. "My father's education had been quite neglected, but being a strong mind and sound judgment and eager after information, he read much and improved himself." And so we start seeing the man that Jefferson becomes, and he starts reading and getting into many of the famous philosophers and scientists that preceded him. Francis Bacon, Sir Isaac Newton. He prided himself on his membership in the American Philosophical Society, which was the leading scientific body here in the colonies in the United States. He boasted to his friend and enemy, John Adams, "I have given up newspapers in exchange for Tacitus and Thucydides and Newton and Euclid, and I find myself much happier." And Jefferson is known for one of the greatest libraries of the time, and he got out of politics, and him and Adams retired to their communities and their nations, and being separated as enemies through the political process, became friends, and the rest of retirement they passed letters back and forth. And I like this idea of Thomas Jefferson continuing to study well after everything he had accomplished, uh, you know, uh, being president of the United States and ambassador to countries all over Europe, and to just retire out. And so those two, if you don't know the story, wrote letters back and forth. And they actually wrote letters to each other the day they died. They died on the same day, July 4th, and I can't remember the date of it, but that's this beautiful story of two companions from the Revolutionary time is quite wonderful. It says in here it was Isaac Newton, above all, who had expanded science and shown how the systems of things might be understood. The consequences of Newton's law of motion were fundamental to the development of physics and astronomy in general. In Newtonian physics, there were theoretical explanations for every event, from the movement of the planets to the swing of a pendulum, and two brilliant analyses from his monumental book, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, published in 1687, provided what would prove to be the real starting point for modern measurement. Newton deduced that instead of being a perfect sphere, the Earth bulged at the equator and flattened at the poles. Consequently, gravity would be stronger at the poles because they were closer to the center of the Earth. And it's pretty amazing in 1687 what Newton was philosophizing on, and what we've now since proven and we use in our calculations and for GPS. People far smarter than me could talk about the gravitational pull and the effects of that, and geoid models and ellipsoids and all of that, but this is the beginning of that science right here with Newton in 1687, and it's pretty amazing what we've proven from his early just conjectures.
Yeah, I was gonna say Jerry can do a Mentoring Mondays presentation on on gravity poles and datums.
Yeah, sure. I got all sorts of time doing all of that.
I wanted to go back. So Jefferson's library was anywhere between 9,000 and 10,000 books, is what he had owned, and then he sold a lot of it to help start the Library of Congress.
Mhm.
And then he passed away July 4th of 1826. So next year's 200 years.
Okay.
So,
Okay. That's pretty amazing.
yeah. And of course, next year's our 250th. So going to be lots of celebrations for the 250th.
Yes, I know there's some really good things planned there. So
Mm-hmm.
let's see. It says Newton's laws also taught a lesson that went beyond physics. In the universities of Aberdeen, Edinburgh, and Glasgow, students were encouraged to believe that just as it was possible to discover through rational inquiry the basic principles that govern the natural world, so reason made it possible to understand the principles governing human nature. This essential outlook of the movement known as Enlightenment was what William Small passed on, and what Jefferson meant by understanding the system of things in which we are placed. Fix reason firmly in her seat and call to her tribunal every fact, every opinion. He would later advise his young nephew, an echo of Small's teaching. Question with boldness even the existence of a God, because if there be one, he must more approve of the homage of reason than that of blindfolded fear. It's all about the pursuit of knowledge, and that's one of Thomas Jefferson's biggest attributes. He was always searching after knowledge. Bottom of this page, I just had another thing highlighted. Those who labor in the earth are chosen people of God, if ever he had a chosen people, whose breast he has made his peculiar deposit for substantial and genuine virtue. Other trades had to depend on the casualties and caprice of customers. Dependence begets subservience, and venality suffocates the germ of virtue and prepares to fit tools for the designs of ambition. But corruption of morals in the mass of cultivators is a phenomenon of which no age nor nation has furnished an example. So while Jefferson, one of these paradoxes of Jefferson is while he was a very well-to-do person, he was still a farmer. He enjoyed farming and walking through his land. When his wife passed, it talks about in here that he would go on long horse rides through the countryside, through his land. And one of his tenets of life was about farming and what type of person that made. So what he's saying here in this quote is those that cultivate the land and self-support themselves, they're not corrupted in their pursuit of riches and all that, and that actually becomes, and we'll read this in the end of this, is the basis for what he was trying to come up with when he created the public land survey system, or the basis of what is the public land survey system. It says at the end of this that he was drawing a bill for Virginia to lay off every county into hundreds or townships of 5 or 6. And at the center was to be a free English school. Jefferson's high standing in the Virginia Assembly led in 1780 to his appointment as governor, but he never succeeded in convincing the legislature of the merits of creating a society of yeoman farmers. I jumped way ahead, Trent, so don't try and... I just wanted to kind of connect those two. So his idea was to create these sections of land that people could own and farm and self-sustain. And so yeah, that's just one of the big paradoxes for Jefferson. In middle of page 57, again, just kind of jumping back where we were. To Jefferson, however, the possession of land was the Newtonian principle that made a democratic society work. It guaranteed the independence of the individual and gave each one an interest in building a law-abiding community. All that was then needed was education to teach them how to best use their freedom. And so, without getting too overly political about that, but I figured, I've done enough talking and give someone else a chance to maybe comment. But any thoughts about Jefferson, or even about kind of that statement about law-abiding community and becoming that? And Jerry will say something. Go for it, Jerry.
Yeah, I always have a comment. I think it's important in introducing Jefferson this early in the story, as well as Putnam for that matter too, because these guys will have an impact on a lot of what happens with the land history in this country. Obviously Jefferson with the Northwest Ordinances and the Louisiana Purchase, the Lewis and Clark expedition, but Putnam also being a surveyor general within the administration of the public land system later on. So finding out some more about the background of these characters will help us to understand a little bit more about how they did what they did. Because most of the stuff you read about the public land survey, the commissioners and that type of thing, you just kind of jump in at the point where, and at this point, Rufus Putnam became commissioner, and then did this and this. But understanding where he came from, this background of the lack of the education and having to learn a lot of stuff on his own, and then getting involved with these land companies, kind of helps us understand a little bit more about how this character developed and what his ideas were behind that. Just like Jefferson's approach with using science and mathematics and stuff, and the stuff that he did later on with the establishment, or trying to establish the standards, the monetary system, the measurement system, and all that type of thing. So that's just an observation that I've got in here.
No, absolutely, and I kind of skipped over, but Putnam was very much. I mean, his daughter in here described him. He was just a doer. He got things done. He was a problem solver, and it was kind of his way or the highway in many ways. But those are the type of people that were getting things done in this time and setting up the country. And so I think that's a wonderful observation.
It does say Putnam's original house is a Airbnb. You can actually stay in it. It was built between 1760 and 1765. It's still standing.
See, and there's a whole other side note there you can get into of all those structures
Exactly.
that are still standing, right? And
Yeah.
they don't build them like they used to, that's for sure. So,
Hmm. Yeah, it's a list on the National Historical Landmarks in Massachusetts.
okay. Any of your thoughts or questions before we move on? Comments? Okay, great. Well, there's a couple more things that I had highlighted talking about Jefferson in the early years here in the Continental Congress. So, at the top of page 58, um, this is kind of just some political highlights here, but it gives an insight, like Jerry said, into who Jefferson was and what his philosophy was. But it says here, the bottom of that first paragraph, only a democratically elected legislature had that power, being the disposal of land. Let me start a little bit further. Since America had been occupied and won without help from the crown, George III had no grounds for claiming power over the disposal of its lands. This is meaning really the French and Indian Wars that they won. Only a democratically elected legislature had that power, Jefferson concluded, and in a phrase that would have been music to any squatter's ears, wrote that if it failed to do so, each individual of the society may appropriate to himself such lands as he finds vacant, and occupancy will give him title. I will kind of nod again to that adverse possession. Um, So after Jefferson had served in the Continental Congress, he returned to Virginia, um, and was helping to write uh, the 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 word just left my mind there, but the charter for Virginia. And so this is very reflective of the United States. It says when he returned to the Virginia legislature after independence was declared in July 1776, he was given an early chance to put his land ownership theory into practice. His reputation as the Declaration's prime author led to his appointment to a committee revising state laws so that they would reflect Republican rather than Royalist values. Although the best known of his proposals was the statute for establishing religious freedom, a landmark legislative tolerance, his primary goal was the wider distribution of land. He introduced a bill to give 75 acres to any Virginian who did not already have any land, and to offer a head right grant of 50 acres to every landless immigrant who arrived in the state from overseas, together with Virginia's generous promise of land to soldiers enlisting in its regiments, ranging from 100 acres for enlisted men and up to 15,000 acres for a major general. Jefferson's land grant proposals would have created a network of small farms, guaranteeing the future health of democracy in the state. And so they're trying to not only just get people to come in, but they believe that the commerce of ownership and building it up and farming it, will create this sense of ownership and tie back to the government and oneness with it, being a part of it. So they're offering all this land to tenants to come in, and Jefferson was at the front of that. So then that's where he also introduces, and I read a little bit of this earlier, but he introduces a bill for the legislature to split it up into townships, and then inside that township to have the center section, which was set for a free English school, which again reflects his priorities of education, and is reflected in the modern PLSS system, the school sections, right? Jumping down to the bottom, page 59. 1 year earlier, in October 1781, Lord Cornwallis and his British army, hemmed in by Washington on land and by the French fleet at sea, had surrendered, and American negotiators were in Paris deciding the terms of the peace. At home, the Continental Congress, which represented the nearest thing to a central government that 13 states could agree on, was attempting to work out the new nation's future government and how to pay off the mountain of debt accumulated in paying for Washington's Continental Army. The United States' single asset, if the negotiators could pry it from Britain's grasp, and the states were prepared to give up their own claims to it, was the land between the Appalachians and the Mississippi. And so now we're going to try and use this land to pay off debts. There are at present many great objects before Congress, wrote the Rhode Island delegate David Howell early in 1784, but none of more importance or which engaged my attention more than that of the Western country, how the land would be used, sold to pay the country's debts, parceled out to Republican farmers, distributed among existing states, divided up to create new states, handed over to settle the claims of the pre-revolutionary land companies, would in large part determine the relationship of the central government to the states. So a little confession here, I did something that was either noble and smart of me or very stupid, but we just had our local municipal elections here in Utah, and I didn't run for a city government, but we did have someone in our city step down outside of the election, and felt so inclined to throw my name in the hat. And last night I did not get the appointment, and I'm not sad about it, but it was one of those calls. You know what, it's time. It may be time for me to do it. But as we met and we discussed it and presented our philosophies on how our city is best to be prepared for the future, there's a couple of interesting statistics that have come up recently. So I live in Davis County, Utah, for anyone that's watching this later, which is just the county north of Salt Lake. So we're a fairly established and fairly developed county as urban sprawl happens. But my city is in the northwest corner of the county, and so we're stuck between what is the I-15 corridor north-south, which is very developed, and the Great Salt Lake. And we have most of the green space for the city, the last parts to be developed. And there's a institute here that recently released a statistic that by 2035, our county will likely be out of developable green space, new green space. It'll all be infill projects and tear downs and whatnot. And so our city's dealing with these same issues that Jefferson and the revolutionaries were. How do we do this? How do we divide out this land so that we can continue to grow, our kids can live here, whatever it might be. And one of the themes that keep coming up is that the Utah government recognizes a housing shortage. There's about 40,000 home shortage is what they estimate in the state here. And there's just no way we're going to build enough homes for that. And so the question is how does Clinton, the city I live in, help the state with this by remaining, a farming community or a bedroom community, and it's interesting is our state legislature will complain that the federal government comes in and tells them what to do. And then our county governments are complaining the state legislature is coming in. And the city government comes in is complaining that the counties are telling them how to run their land, and then all the homeowners are sitting there complaining because the city's telling them what they can and cannot do with their land and zoning over it and everything. But as I read through this, I'm very much reminded of what they were going through and how they are trying to plan out the future of their country and how to lay it out. So I'll just read this last paragraph here. It says, in June 1783, Jefferson was elected a delegate from Virginia to the Continental Congress and immersed himself in the many great objects before it, above all, in the question of the Western lands. Preserved in the liberty of Congress are pages of his comments on proposed legislation and draft bills whose margins are filled with his detailed annotations. In the space of less than a year, from June 1783 to May 1784, this escape into mental work produced numerous contributions to U.S. law, and 3 measures so substantial that they were to permeate every aspect of American life: the invention of the dollar, the procedure for creating states from the Western territory, and the means of surveying that territory. Had Jefferson had his way, there would have been a 4th. The invention of a new set of weights and measures indicates the cohesion of his thinking, that all 4 form part of a single logical structure. And I think that's just a perfect way to sum up who he was and his influence on the United States. And we'll start seeing that in the next chapters as we look at that expansion west and the measuring of that.
And it's quiet.
And it's quiet. Jerry, finish us out with an inspiring thought here.
Inspiring thought. Well, there's just this one bridge thought that I think we need to look at in there. And this is on the bottom of page 50, what the heck was that now? Oh, 57 to 58. You'd start talking a little bit about that, but he's talking in there when we normally think of when the settlers first came over here and they got the charters from the governments and stuff like that, that the land belonged to the king and all that. And Jefferson makes a point in there about saying that's an artificial construct that was introduced into England by William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror? Yes. What the norm is. Before that, there was private ownership. It was only a relatively recent thing in England that they had that introduced from the continental European type of stuff. So when you think about it, what Jefferson was saying is we need to go back to the way it was, where it's not the king's land that he meets out the people, but it's the people's land to begin with. And I think that goes back to the fundamental philosophy and the thought behind Jefferson and his concept of the yeoman farmer, because he and Hamilton were at odds with respect to each other as to how the government should be set up. But when you look at them, they were both from the aristocracy, from that class. But Jefferson saw it as the individual was important, whereas Hamilton looked at it more as more of a royal type of approach to things. So all these little tidbits and stuff like that in there, they start to make up the fabric of what we ultimately wound up being as a country, let alone as how we distributed and viewed land.
It's interesting to note, again, the paradox that is Jefferson. He was from aristocracy from birth, right? His dad was well-to-do. He was, when his dad died, he was put with these wealthy land prospectors, right? The land company and the grantors of that. But Hamilton, on the other hand, was born poor, right? So Jefferson started out rich and was very much thinking about the lower class. And Hamilton, who started out poor and wanted to be upper class, how their their past diverged from their upbringing.
Yeah, that's such a good point. That's a good way
And
to.
$10 if anyone can sing the Hamilton song, right? A poor boy from.
Yeah, he's an orphan. We watch it faithfully, pretty much anytime we're just. It's great background on Disney Plus. So
Yep.
we probably watched it 300-400 times. I've seen it in person probably. We're probably up to 15 times now, including in New York. So
Last week, on a side note, since you're talking about that one, we're done with the chapter here. I went and watched. We got tickets to a musical called Suffs, SUFS. It's about the
ours
suffragette
it's coming
movement.
up here. Yeah.
Yeah, it was fast. I really enjoyed it. A coworker had gone, and I asked her, I'm like, okay, am I going to like it? She's like, oh, you might be a little bored, and I really enjoyed it. It was really good. So if you get a chance to, if it's coming up there, go see it.
Yeah, we have season tickets to our Broadway, so yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well that's what I have for this chapter this week. If no one else has anything, our next one is called Simple Arithmetic.
How simple can it be?
It was just 1 mile square by 1 mile square. Come on.
That's right. That'll be December 3rd. December 3rd is our next one. Yeah, December 3rd. So
Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody. Get the word out. Let's get some more people in here. We started out strong and we're
I know,
slowly, so
dwindling away. We'll get it going again.
yep. Okay, thanks everybody. Have a great night.
Have a great Thanksgiving, everybody.
Week.
Bye, everybody.